Trump immediately undermined his own effort. And I just want to make something clear. It's very important. Vaccine or no vaccine, we're back. The economy was reopening no matter what happened. In many cases, they don't have vaccines, and a virus or a flu comes, and you fight through it. 41. At 9:18 p.m. on Friday, May 22, 2020, I reached President Trump by phone at the White House. What about your relationship with Chinese President Xi? You know, Trump said to me, I've very much hardened on China, so I'm not happy. Let me tell you, I'm not a happy camper. What turned you? I asked. I wanted people to go into China, he said, referring to the crack U.S. team of medical experts Trump, Redfield, and Fauci wanted to send to investigate the virus back in January. I said I knew he had tried twice with Xi. He didn't want to do it, Trump said, referring to Xi. I was okay with it. You know why? Because I figured they knew what they were doing, okay? And they either did, or they were incompetent, and either one is no good. Trump was doing a 180-degree turn from his natural optimism. He seemed to be searching for someone to blame. But he stiffed you, I said, when you look back. No, he didn't stiff. Let's say, he's a prideful person, Trump said, but he thought he was able to contain it. He added, tellingly, or not. Trump continued. I think what could have happened, Bob, is it got away from them, and he didn't want to contain it from the rest of the world because it would have put him at a big disadvantage, and we were already beating them very badly, on trade. Now I was utterly surprised. It had never occurred to me that Trump would think President Xi had intentionally let the virus spread. Trump turned to the book. You're probably going to screw me, Trump said. Because that's the way it goes. Look, Bush sat with you for hours and you screwed him. But the difference was, I ain't no Bush. Boy, oh boy, what a mess. I'm trying to get out of that mess that he got us into in the Middle East. He talked about his ambitious goals for troop withdrawals and obtaining more money from countries the U.S. helped protect. As he put it, even a little thing like getting massive amounts of money from some of these countries that were free-riding us. At another point, Trump turned to his judicial nominations. I'm going to be up to 280 judges very soon. A lot of them are older, and we convinced many of them to go on senior leave. He meant senior status, in which judges can effectively retire but stay active on the bench with a reduced caseload. This leaves a vacancy the president can fill. And more importantly, Trump said, Obama gave us 142 judges when I came here. They're like golden nuggets. Republicans had controlled the Senate for the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, and Majority Leader McConnell blocked most appointments. Do you ever get down? I asked. Do you ever feel, my God, an avalanche of 1,000 problems has descended on me? This is a good thing, Trump said. I'm so busy. And he laughed. I don't have time to get down, okay? It's crazy. And he immediately went off on how the United States was providing protection to Saudi Arabia, but he had told the Saudis, you've got to pay. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien shared Trump's suspicions about Xi and China. In a West Wing White House meeting more than 2 weeks later, June 11th, O'Brien told an aide that China had concealed what was happening. They covered it up, he said, referring to the government's attempts to conceal the genetic sequencing on the virus. One lab published it, and then it was immediately taken down, and the lab was threatened. O'Brien continued, it appears that they closed down travel all through China so that this disease couldn't get to Shanghai or Beijing and other key cities. But at the same time, they're letting other folks travel from Wuhan to all over Europe and infected the United States. That's not good. But whatever happened, the Chinese have repurposed it into a bioweapon. And they're using it. They're attempting to take advantage of COVID to gain a geopolitical advantage over the United States and the free world, and to displace the United States as the leading power in the world. O'Brien considered Trump's assertion that Xi didn't want to contain it from the rest of the world because it would have put him at a big disadvantage as an absolutely reasonable hypothesis. In 2020, an aggressive new approach to international relations called wolf warrior diplomacy had emerged from a defensive China. O'Brien said since COVID hit the whole world, they're using it with what they call their wolf diplomacy, and for a long time, they were attempting to trade PPE to get access for Huawei into countries. They were bullying countries into thanking them. They were bullying countries into saying things about the U.S. But overall, the theme is that they, as an authoritarian government, with all their surveillance state and their concentration camps and all that sort of thing, offer a better alternative for the world, a more efficient alternative, a kind of weird, nationalistic, technocratic alternative to the world that's better than liberal democracy. And COVID is an example of why the world should embrace China and Chinese values, and the Chinese form of hybrid capitalist, mercantilist, communist government. O'Brien said, they're taking every measure possible during this crisis to displace the United States, and we've got a hell of a fight on our hands. They covered up a lot about this virus because they want to present this model of ruthless efficiency, he said. For example, the Chinese have said that somewhere between 4,000 and 15,000 people in China died from the virus. O'Brien said he believed that the true number was in the 100,000 range, about the same as in the U.S. in late May. O'Brien described an apocalyptic wasteland gleaned from social media before it was removed by government censors. They welded people into their apartments. They eventually came in a couple weeks later and pried open the doors and opened up. There were a lot of elderly people that died of dehydration and starvation. There were all kinds of people that hung themselves out their windows. O'Brien concluded the consequences were dire. If we lose our economic edge and we lose our economic might and stay closed for too much longer, we might be in a position where we couldn't stay ahead, or maybe we'd get behind and couldn't catch up. For CDC Chief Redfield, the Chinese failure to close down international flights was disastrous. He told colleagues the United States had silently filled with COVID-19 infections from Italy, Spain, Germany, France, Great Britain, Belgium. All this late winter travel brought clusters of COVID to the United States. Also unknown to us that probably half of those clusters weren't even symptomatic, so you couldn't find them with airport screening. It was difficult to understand how China had aggressive travel restrictions within China and yet did not move to any travel restrictions for people who wanted to leave China and go abroad, Redfield said. If there could have been one major global action that could have really saved hundreds of thousands of lives, it's if they had just shut down their out-of-China travel at the same time they shut down their intra-China travel. They really started moving in the latter part of January. That's where they quarantined people. That's where they shut down the city. That's where they stopped the trains. They really locked down all of Wuhan at one point. I think they quarantined over 11 million people. You couldn't go from Wuhan to Beijing, but you could go Wuhan to London. 42. On May 25th, a Minneapolis police officer was caught on video with his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, torturing and killing Floyd, a 46-year-old black man. A massive wave of angry protests erupted in more than 2,000 cities and towns on a scale not seen in America since the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. Black Lives Matter extended its reach as a rallying cry against racism and police brutality. While most of the protests against police misconduct and racial inequality were peaceful, television news was filled with chaotic scenes of rioting, looting, and buildings set afire in major cities. In Washington, D.C., a fire was set in the basement nursery of the historic St. John's Episcopal Church, 1,000 feet from the White House, on Sunday, May 31st. Following the fire, the church had been boarded up. A city curfew set by D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser was scheduled to begin the next day, June 1st, at 7 p.m. Trump, in a phone call with governors that afternoon, stressed the need to use force against the demonstrators. He wanted an energetic crackdown. You have to dominate, Trump said. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. They're going to run all over you. You'll look like a bunch of jerks. You have to dominate, and you have to arrest people, and you have to try people, and they have to go to jail for long periods of time. That day, hundreds of mostly peaceful protesters gathered in the area around Lafayette Square, a 7-acre public park between St. John's Church and the White House. At around 6:30 p.m., without apparent provocation, officers in riot gear suddenly advanced on the protesters, tossing riot control devices into the crowd that created loud explosions, sparks, and smoke. Videos show officers pushing protesters to the ground, shooting some with rubber projectiles and spraying others with a chemical agent. Authorities shot pepper balls, projectiles containing a powdered chemical that irritates the eyes and nose, at the protesters. Officers on horseback pushed protesters further away from Lafayette Square. I didn't see any provocation that would warrant the deployment of munitions, Mayor Bowser said afterward. It was a jarring display of militarized government forces against those exercising their First Amendment rights to assemble. At 6:48 p.m., just minutes after forces dispersed the protesters, Trump began a speech in the White House's Rose Garden about the unrest sweeping across the country. All Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd, Trump said. My administration is fully committed that, for George and his family, justice will be served. He will not have died in vain. But we cannot allow the righteous cries and peaceful protesters to be drowned out by an angry mob. The biggest victims of the rioting are peace-loving citizens in our poorest communities, and as their president, I will fight to keep them safe. I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order, and an ally of all peaceful protesters. Trump spent most of the 7-minute address promising to combat what he described as riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. He recommended that each governor deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. If a city or a state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, he said, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them. After his Rose Garden address at about 7 p.m., Trump left the White House grounds. A coterie of advisors followed, including Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Mark Milley in a camouflage uniform, White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, O'Brien, Attorney General Barr, Kushner, and Ivanka. The president walked the 1,000 feet north through Lafayette Square to St. John's, known as the Church of the Presidents. When the president reached the church, Ivanka pulled a Bible out of her white handbag and handed it to her father. Trump stood in front of the church for about 2 minutes, holding the Bible awkwardly and waving it around. Is that your Bible? A reporter asked. It's a Bible, Trump answered. A reporter asked the president what his thoughts were. We have a great country, he said. That's my thoughts. It appeared the president had walked to the church to give photographers and cameramen an opportunity to take his picture with the burned church and a Bible as props. After a few moments, Trump motioned to his advisors, and Meadows, Barr, Esper, O'Brien, and Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany walked over to join him in standing in a line in front of the church. I am outraged, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, Marianne Edgar Buddy, said afterward. Everything he has said and done is to inflame violence. This evening, Episcopal Church presiding Bishop Michael Curry said, the President of the United States stood in front of St. John's Episcopal Church, lifted up a Bible, and had pictures of himself taken. In so doing, he used a church building and the Holy Bible for partisan political purposes. Later, the White House and the U.S. Park Police defended the dispersal of the crowd, citing violent protesters. Footage of the protest shows that at least 2 protesters threw water bottles at the police. About 3 hours later, 2 helicopters operated by the D.C. Army National Guard hovered over the remaining protesters. The helicopters flew as low as 45 feet, below the heights of some buildings, creating wind speeds equivalent to a tropical storm, snapping thick tree limbs, swirling the air with dust and broken glass. Many protesters ran for cover in panic and confusion. The use of helicopters to disperse civilians is a common tactic in war zones. Mattis broke his long-held silence, issuing a statement. When I joined the military some 50 years ago, Mattis wrote, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Never did I dream that troops taking that same oath would be ordered under any circumstance to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens, much less to provide a bizarre photo op for the elected commander-in-chief with military leadership standing alongside. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try, he continued. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. Trump responded with a series of tweets later that evening. I didn't like his leadership style or much else about him, and many others agree, Trump tweeted about Mattis. Glad he is gone. Soon after, Mayor Bowser had Black Lives Matter painted in giant yellow letters on the street leading to Lafayette Square and the White House. Protests against racial injustice and inequities continued to fill streets across the country in the weeks that followed. 2 days after his law and order speech, Trump returned my call. It was the morning of June 3rd. Hi, Bob, how's the book? Am I keeping you busy enough? You give me new chapters, I said. Yeah, it's law and order, Bob. Law and order. We're right where I want. Do you have a few minutes to law and order, Bob? He launched into his talking points about how the economy would start to get better, how the states that were reopening were strong, and how the administration was doing very well on vaccines and therapeutics for the virus. And we're going to get ready to send in the military/National Guard to some of these poor bastards that don't know what they're doing, these poor radical lefts. And he added pointedly, of course, you're a poor radical left to an extent, I guess. I asked if Trump had watched the George Floyd tape. Yeah, I saw it. It was terrible. I thought it was a terrible thing. I've said it. He reminded me that in an earlier speech in Florida for a NASA and SpaceX rocket launch, he had talked about George Floyd. He had devoted 8 minutes to Floyd. Where did you watch it? Did he watch the whole thing, or just parts of it? Sure, I got to watch it. Everybody did. All you need was a television. I watched it numerous times. I mean, mostly I was in the White House, upstairs, because I don't get to watch much television during the day. I mean, upstairs, and I watched it. It's been on. It's been on a lot. No, it's a terrible thing, and strong feeling toward it. I don't like it at all. I'm very unhappy about it. And action has been taken, and it will be taken, and it will be dealt with. And I think the riots are... I put it out in Minneapolis. That was the worst one of all. They were ripping down the city. They're all liberal Democrats. Every one of them is a liberal Democrat. Hard to believe, right? How did you decide, okay, I'm going to give that law and order speech? It was very easy for me to decide, he said, because I looked and there was no law and order. And the radical left Dems and the Democrat, they're all Democrat mayors or governors. I mean, every one of them. Every one of them. Every one where there's weakness is that. So that was an easy speech for me to write. Usually, I write them and or substantially adjust them. Did somebody help you? Yeah, I get people. They come up with ideas, but the ideas are mine, Bob. The ideas are mine. Want to know something? Everything's mine. You know? Everything is mine. I asked about his walk to St. John's and the treatment of the protesters there. It's total bullshit, he said. They didn't use tear gas. First-hand witnesses, including reporters and videos, showed law enforcement officers using pepper spray, smoke canisters, and pepper balls to disperse the crowd. Well, Trump said, these nice, wonderful people tried to burn down the church the day before. You know, they were all saying these were nice people. Well, they weren't nice people. They were rough people. And the day before, they tried to burn down the church. And so now the Republicans are all on my side. By the way, I had a big night last night. We won all of every race that I endorsed. And I'm 64-0 this congressional cycle, 64-0 on endorsements. Both wins and wins in primaries. And many of them were losing before I endorsed. At the time, it was true. And so the idea of standing there with the Bible, that's quite a photo, I said. It's my idea. Nobody else. And a lot of people loved it. A lot of people did, I acknowledged. And I'm sure a lot of people don't. Perhaps. Why did you decide to use the Bible as a symbol? I asked. Because I thought it was terrible that they tried to rip down a church that was built simultaneously with the White House, and whose first parishioner was James Madison. And I thought it was a terrible thing, and a terrible symbol that they could do such a thing. And made a strong statement, and people loved it. Other than the radical left, people loved it. And by the way, they ought to appreciate it, but they tried to knock it as much as possible. News reports said he had been rushed to the emergency White House bunker called the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, PEOC, on May 29th. Did you go down in the bunker? For a period, Trump said. I had a choice, and it was really more of an inspection than anything else. Because they wanted me to inspect it. It was a very minor event, and I just went down to inspect it. It was, first of all, it was during the day, where there was no problem during the day at all. You know, Trump continued, when people get rambunctious, it happens during the night. This was during the day, long before there was any darkness. And they said, would you like to inspect it now? Would you like to go down? I said, oh, I'll go down. And then they write a fake piece in the New York Times, like I'm sitting in a bunker. That was during the day, and it was the inspection, the second time I've ever seen it. Were you there a long time or just looking around? 15 minutes, just looking around. Looking around, came right up. It was during the day. It's not exactly a cozy place, is it? I said. No, it's just, you know, it was really, you're supposed to go and inspect it. And I did. And I did it. They said this would be a good time. I said, why? They said, well, we got people outside, but there's no problem. It was, I think, 4, 5 in the afternoon. It was during the day. It was beautiful. Who suggested that you inspect it? I asked. Huh? One of the Secret Service guys said, you don't have to do it now. I didn't have to go down. I went down as an inspection. And they said I went down. And the reason I went down as an inspection was it was appropriate to do because I had to go down and inspect it anyway. And they made it sound like I was in there. Not that there'd be anything wrong. Plenty of people had been. Not a big deal. Not a big deal. And down there's not a big deal. But I was only there for 15, 20 minutes. And it was more walking around, looking at things. I see. And you didn't go again? I asked. No, I didn't go again. I went one time very quickly. It was an inspection. And they made it sound like it was, again, Bob, it was during the day. Listen, that's why I'm asking, I said. Attorney General Barr would later say on Fox News that it was not an inspection. Things were so bad that the Secret Service recommended the president go down to the bunker. There were very few people during the day, Trump went on. There were almost no protesters. The police had violently broken up the June 1st protest. No, Trump said. That's only if you watch CNN and if you watch MSDNC. Or you read the New York Times or your favorite newspaper, the Washington Post. Outside of that, the people are very unhappy. These are arsonists. They're thugs. They're anarchists. And they're bad people. They're bad people. Very bad people. Very dangerous people. Even the peaceful protesters, I said. There are a lot of peaceful protesters. There are not many. I'll tell you what. Not many. These are very well-organized thugs. You'll be seeing that when it comes out. These are very well-organized. Antifa's leading it. These are very well-organized events. Very well-organized. Antifa, an abbreviation for anti-fascist, is a decentralized movement. It is not an organization and does not have a leader or membership dues. Well, I said, we're going into the election. Everyone keeps asking, suppose it's a close election and it's contested. What are you going to do? Everyone says Trump is going to stay in the White House if it's contested. Have you? Well, I'm not. I don't want to even comment on that, Bob. I don't want to comment on that at this time. Trump referenced the book I was working on about him. If I have a fair book, it's going to be a great book. Did you see the book they wrote about Trump and Churchill? Did you see it? It just came out. He was referring to Trump and Churchill, Defenders of Western Civilization by Nick Adams, a conservative commentator. And he gave me a rating as one of the greatest presidents ever. Trump turns to his future. The economy? I'll do it again. It's already started. By September, October, the economy will start heading up. And once it starts heading up, and in big numbers, we're going to have a phenomenal following year. But by September, October, maybe sooner, but by September, October, you'll start to see tremendous jumps in employment and GDP. And by October, it'll be really big. And the numbers will be announced, and I'll win the election. Watch. Better than where I was before. Better. Where I was riding high. I returned to the immediate story of the massive protests. You bought ownership of the whole problem, I said, the racial tensions, by making your declaration of law and order. Law and order, that's right, he said. I'll take my chances. It would be an honor to get a good book from you, but that probably won't happen. But that's okay too. Thanks, Bob. 43. After Trump stood in front of the church waving a Bible, Lindsey Graham privately said that night, I've never been more worried than I am right now. In Graham's view, Trump could have chosen 3 ways to respond to the racial unrest unleashed by the George Floyd murder. George Wallace, Robert Kennedy, or Richard Nixon. Graham believed Trump had chosen Wallace, the firebrand former Alabama governor who embodied defiant resistance to civil rights. In his inaugural address, Wallace had promised, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. In 1963, he stood in the door at the University of Alabama to block 2 black students from enrolling. Trump had poured gasoline on the tensions. Graham wished Trump would, instead, appoint a presidential commission to deal with policing and race, and then get tough on the protesters. The key was to redefine the way police interacted with their communities. Graham wondered, do you really want to deploy the active duty military against Americans unless you have to? The military has a lot of respect from everybody. Do you really want to get them in the middle of this shit show? Right now, his presidency's very much at risk, Graham said. This thing has the potential now to eat him alive. But at the moment, Trump and Graham were not talking. Trump wanted Graham, as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to call former President Obama as a witness in his investigation of the origins of the Russia investigation and allegations the Obama administration had spied on the 2016 Trump campaign. Graham had refused publicly, saying, "I understand President Trump's frustration, but be careful what you wish for." But the freeze-out did not last long. Trump and Graham needed each other, or at least their cherished phone dialogue. In a series of phone calls through the first 2 weeks of June, Graham presented a grim assessment directly to Trump. "Right now," Graham told Trump, "if the election were held, you would lose." Trump disagreed vociferously, saying he didn't believe that at all. "The photo op in front of the church backfired," Graham said. Again, Trump disagreed strongly. "The anti-police movement no doubt was overreaching," Graham said. "Trying to defund the police or banning them from a stretch of occupied streets in downtown Seattle was untenable. Some of these people are just insane," Graham said. "But you've got to be more than the law and order guy. You're going to have to be the guy that puts points on the board for the country." Graham knew Trump's Democratic opponent Joe Biden better than probably any Republican. He had been close friends with the former vice president, traveled the world with him, and publicly praised him as a thoroughly decent human being. "I don't think you can disqualify Joe Biden," Graham told Trump. "You can make people have doubts about him, but you need to show you can solve problems." Graham said he had doubts about a heavy law and order campaign similar to Nixon's in 1968. Richard Nixon was the challenger, not the incumbent. As the incumbent president, Graham said, Trump had to show he could govern, make changes, and improve the lives of people. Examples of points on the board. Never shy about sharing his ideas, Graham had a three-part plan. Police reform through an executive order, a massive infrastructure bill to rebuild roads and schools, and, an old Graham favorite, protect DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. DACA, put in place by Obama, protected more than 700,000 undocumented young adults who had been brought to the United States as children. They were called Dreamers. The Trump administration had ended the program, and the matter was in the courts. "But if you could solve the DACA problem or make an incredible effort to solve it," Graham told Trump, "then that becomes your criminal justice reform for the Hispanic community." Graham told Trump he believed the Democrats would overplay their hand. "If it weren't for the Democratic Party, the Republican Party would fold," Graham said. "They always keep us in the game. They're able to throw us a lifeline. So this defund the police, occupation of Seattle, and this crazy shit is going to put you back in the game. But you have to solve problems. You've got to show that your presidency is worth voting for because you can get something done. So go big on infrastructure, deal with DACA, and do police reform." Graham pushed. Piling up a series of field goals and maybe a touchdown to grab the lead in the fourth quarter was the way to win. Trump wasn't buying it. In golf, every player had a favorite club he wanted to hit, especially under pressure, and Graham knew that the president wanted to use his go-to shot of division. He argued that labeling Trump's opponents and enemies and out-tweeting Biden would not work here. Trump had to deliver. The president still was not buying. Graham was also pushing to get $3 to $4 billion for the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization to distribute a COVID-19 vaccine in the developing world if the United States ever came up with one. Graham was also trying to get another $3 to $4 billion to buy the vaccine. Good policy and good politics, he figured. Former President George W. Bush, a big promoter of aid to the developing world, called Graham. "You tell the president if he does this," Bush said, "it'll really help him a lot." "I will," Graham said. "Would you want to talk to Trump?" No, Bush said. "He'd misconstrue anything I said." Trump regularly criticized Bush. "Yeah," said Graham, "you're probably right. President Trump can be a handful, but he's a smart guy." Graham, who was running for re-election himself and had a large stake in the outcome for Trump and the Republican Party, made his rounds. He called Trump's campaign manager Brad Parscale. "Trump's problem is all about tone," Parscale said. "There's no revolting against Trump policy out there." They needed a softer Trump. Police reform and softening him up and policy initiatives that would soften him up is what we need to do. Parscale added, "Police reform is really as much about moderate whites as it is about the African-American community politically." He said that police reform would help with suburban women, as would DACA and infrastructure, anything that improves hope for the economy. In another conversation, Trump told Graham that he wanted to go higher than $3 trillion for another economic stimulus and recovery package. "Don't worry about the base," Graham said. "Nobody elected you as a fiscal conservative." He tried to reinforce his plan. Just imagine the combination of police reform, bipartisan, DACA, bipartisan, infrastructure, bipartisan, stimulus, bipartisan, a growing economy, all before November. A big infrastructure package would give the country a needed facelift, Graham said. No other Republicans would spend the needed money. Not George W. Bush, and not Graham's great friend, the late John McCain. Trump seemed to be listening. "The virus could undercut everything I just talked about," Graham said. "Why'd you tell me that?" Trump said. "It's just true." Trump said again that it was all unfair that this was dropped on him. "Well, it's unfair to everybody. It's part of being president. Things happen." They agreed that there was no way to shut down the country again, even as virus outbreaks were causing great alarm in lots of southern and western states. The infection rates, the number of cases, didn't worry Graham that much. The majority of people had mild symptoms, and many had no symptoms at all. "What I care about is how many people go in the hospital and the number of deaths due to the virus. Can you control the infections so that you don't overrun the hospitals?" So much hinged on the vaccines. Trump's opponent was now fear, Graham told Trump. On police reform, Graham advised, "You've got to push your base." That would mean pissing cops off, he said, and perhaps supporting a file-sharing system, so if one cop was fired from one police department, that record would follow him to the next, and making it easier to fire police officers. Trump had initially resisted criminal justice reform, known as the First Step Act, reforming prisons and sentencing passed by Congress and signed into law in 2018. But Kushner had pushed it hard, and it passed with large bipartisan majorities. It was working politically, so Trump now clung to it. Graham realized Trump rewrote the history on that and said he had always been for it. Graham told Trump that the photo op at St. John's Church didn't help his cause much. "Christians loved it," Trump said. "Well, I'm not a good Christian," Graham said, "but I'm a Christian, and I particularly didn't love it. I think most people don't like waving the Bible. Mr. President, that just didn't work." Though they had started out as opponents in 2016 when Graham had run for president, Graham had come to genuinely like Trump. It was not just the political advantage that accrued from a public friendship with the president or the influence Graham wielded with Trump by staying in his orbit with frequent phone calls and golf outings. Trump could have a consequential presidency despite all the drama, and Graham wanted to remain a Trump ally. If the president considered someone an ally, he would accept their criticism. He would never accept criticism if he came to see them as an enemy. But it's all at risk now, he told Trump candidly. Part of the question was whether Trump could respond to the political and emotional stress. After the George Floyd murder, Graham believed there was no going back politically. He did not believe Trump needed to show a conversion on the road to Damascus on race, but he did need to define the problem more honestly. It's a once-in-a-lifetime chance to re-energize America, Graham told Trump. If you do these three things right, DACA, police reform and infrastructure, you will have a more consequential presidency and you are more likely to get re-elected. If you try to be the law and order president alone, you're going to lose. 44. The first 6 months of 2020 had been a taxing time for Fauci, who was trying to balance what he believed was the obligation to provide the public with accurate medical information and advice necessary to fight COVID-19 with some of Trump's less than helpful statements and attitudes. In Fauci's view, some of Trump's early decisions had been his finest hours, restricting travel from China, January 31st, and Europe, March 11th, and asking sick Americans to stay home and all to practice good hygiene with his initial 15 days to slow the spread, March 16th, and then extending it for another 30 days, March 29th. The president had stepped up to the task and had listened to Birx, Redfield, himself, and others. When Trump engaged in wishful thinking about the virus, musing it would disappear on its own, Fauci at least could correct the record on television. Then, on April 7th, Trump said of the virus, "It will go away." He had said that many times before, but on that day, Mark Meadows, in his first week as White House Chief of Staff, had installed a new White House press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany. A 31-year-old unbending Trump campaign spokesperson and Harvard Law School graduate, McEnany limited Fauci's television appearances. Under the system, all the networks and cable news outlets had to submit a request for a Fauci interview in writing to the Department of Health and Human Services, who then in turn would pass it to the White House for approval. It was like the requests were disappearing into a black hole. No action, no response. 1 in 10 of the requests would be approved, so it would not look like Fauci was being completely muzzled. On April 17th, in the middle of what was supposed to be the 30-day extension of the 15 days to slow the spread, Trump tweeted, "Liberate Minnesota, liberate Michigan, and liberate Virginia," expressing support for a subversion of his own guidelines. Fauci's jaw dropped. He asked his colleagues what was going on. The answer was obvious. The finest hours were over. The White House and Trump were laser-determined to open up the country. That was Plan A. There was no Plan B, an essential, Fauci believed, when dealing with a virus that was out of control. Fauci gave an interview to Science magazine and said that when things were said at the coronavirus task force press conferences which were not factual, I can't jump in front of the microphone and push him down. That was as edgy as Fauci got in public, though he often adopted a challenging tone with the president at the daily task force press conferences. After the president said once again that the virus would disappear, Fauci decided he had better be the skunk at the picnic at the next task force meeting, which was held in the Oval Office and was supposed to be confidential. "We need to be careful," Fauci said, intentionally addressing not just Trump, but the other task force members who were present. "This is not going to just disappear. It's not going to go away by itself. It's going to be up to us." They had to continue to mitigate and find a vaccine. "I know a guy who got sick," the president responded, repeating an anecdote they had all heard before, changing the subject and overpowering the session. "The president is on a separate channel," Fauci later told others. Trump's leadership was rudderless. Another time, Fauci made an appeal to others in the Oval Office after the president had strayed from the facts in the press briefing. "We can't let the president be out there being vulnerable," Fauci said, saying something that's going to come back and bite him. Pence, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, Kushner, and aide Stephen Miller tensed up at once. It was palpable to Fauci. It was as if they were saying, "You can't be talking to the president that way." They were an unyielding fortress around the president. Often when Fauci challenged Trump on something he had said, Trump would jump in and change the subject. Fauci marveled at Trump, who would hopscotch from one topic to another. "His attention span is like a minus number," Fauci said privately. Trump seemed interested in one outcome. His sole purpose is to get reelected, Fauci told an associate. Fauci was particularly disappointed in Kushner, who talked like a cheerleader as if everything was great. Fauci tried to preserve the candor, but with a gentle touch. "Mr. President," he said another time, "I really would be careful about saying it that way. They're going to come back and criticize you." "Who gives a shit?" Trump replied. "They criticize me no matter what I do anyway." Trump never invited Fauci or the other medical professionals to brief him in detail or provide a tutorial. Nor did Fauci ever ask for extended time or time alone with the president. Fauci gave high marks to Matt Pottinger for realizing China's deceit. Going back to late January, Fauci and Pottinger had a serious conversation about how China had covered up the 2003 SARS epidemic, not telling the public the truth for 3 months after the outbreak. Fauci publicly said China had been egregiously non-transparent during SARS. For Pottinger, the new virus fit the old pattern. China was doing it again. "They're the source of it," Pottinger said. "You know you can't believe anything they say. I know them. I was a reporter there. They're all lying. They're full of crap. It's worse than they're really saying." Pottinger said he had a doctor friend in China with impeccable credentials and access to solid information who was passing it on. The doctor said, "Don't believe their numbers. They're all lying to you." Fauci thought Pottinger was talking as if the sky was falling and way overstating the case against China. "We gotta be more aggressive in trying to control it," Pottinger told Fauci, because countries like Singapore and Taiwan have been able to control it by being very aggressive in shutting things down. Hong Kong had done the same. When the pandemic later exploded, Fauci said, "Wait a minute. Matt was right all along. This thing is really out of control." Despite Trump's ambivalent public statements that he thought the virus would dissipate with or without a vaccine, the push for a vaccine was nonstop. As part of Operation Warp Speed, drug companies were being prepaid billions of dollars to manufacture millions of doses of drugs that might not pass trials or even be used. The design was to ensure the drug companies immediately would have the supply after a new vaccine was approved. In an Oval Office task force meeting at 4 p.m. on June 2nd, Moncef Slaoui, the new vaccine czar and head of Operation Warp Speed, and all the others told the president that December was the earliest a vaccine might be ready. More likely, it would be January, February, or March 2021. "Can't we get a vaccine earlier?" Trump asked. "What about the fall? How about in September and October?" The answer was no. Fauci said the president might hear or read about the Chinese or the Brits or others claiming they could get a vaccine in September or October, but that would not be one that cleared the stringent U.S. regulatory hurdles. It would be almost impossible to prove such an early vaccine would be safe and effective. Trump called me unexpectedly on Friday, June 19th at 10:30 a.m. We had not spoken for over 2 weeks. I said I was finishing a draft of this book and was running into some roadblocks with his calls with Chinese President Xi Jinping. I had very good calls with him, Trump said, but since they sent us the plague, I'm not so thrilled with them, okay? I reminded him he had previously told me this, but my reporting showed that some of his aides were suggesting something more sinister. There's some evidence that this is quite dark and nefarious, that they're allowed the virus to spread. What do you think? I'm the one that said that louder and clearer than anybody, Trump said. If you want to know the truth, I'm the leader of that group, because I think they could have kept it. Now it is starting up in Beijing, which is interesting, because I was saying, but they've got a problem in Beijing. What are they up to? I asked. What's their motive? I think they could have done a hell of a lot better job stopping it coming out to the rest of the world, including the United States and Europe, Trump said. Do you think they intentionally let it come to the United States and the rest of the world? I asked. There's a possibility. I don't say they did, but there's certainly a possibility. He added, but it came to Europe, the United States, and the rest of the world. Yep. If they actually did this intentionally, President Trump, the ink wasn't dry on my great deal on trade, he said. They're buying a lot of stuff. And by the way, they are buying. And that's one of the things I watch every day. They're buying a lot. They're buying tremendous amounts of farm product and stuff, but the ink wasn't dry when the plague came in. 2 days earlier, the Wall Street Journal had published an excerpt of former National Security Advisor John Bolton's book, The Room Where It Happened. In it, Bolton wrote of a meeting between Trump and Xi. Quote, Trump then stunningly turned the conversation to the coming U.S. presidential election, alluding to China's economic capability and pleading with Xi to ensure he'd win. He stressed the importance of farmers and increased Chinese purchases of soybeans and wheat in the electoral outcome. End quote. Trump went on, Bob, watch what happens, okay? Remember, I told you, the stock market is close to an all-time high and we're not finished with the pandemic yet. I have a rally tomorrow night in Oklahoma. Over 1.2 million people have signed up. We can only take about 60,000, because it's a big arena, right? But we can take 22,000 in one arena, 40,000 in another. We're going to have 2 arenas loaded. But think of that. Nobody ever had rallies like that. Your reaction to the protests? I asked, switching subjects. I think that the weak liberal Democrats have handled their cities very badly, and I think the strong people have handled it very well. You'll see what happens in Oklahoma. You'll see what happens in Oklahoma. We're all set. We share one thing in common, I said. We're white, privileged. My father was a lawyer and a judge in Illinois, and we know what your dad did. And do you have any sense that that privilege has isolated and put you in a cave to a certain extent, as it put me, and I think lots of white privileged people, in a cave? And that we have to work our way out of it to understand the anger and the pain, particularly black people feel in this country? No, Trump said. You really drank the Kool-Aid, didn't you? Just listen to you, he said, his voice mocking and incredulous. Wow, no, I don't feel that at all. You don't. I've done more for the black community than any president in history, with the possible exception of Lincoln, repeating one of his favorite lines. He had said so publicly at least 5 times by that point in 2020 alone. I don't think it's the Kool-Aid, Mr. President. I think there is a reality out there that black people feel. And part of our job is, you and I talked about this some months ago, that you're governing in an environment where there are 2 Americas. Yep, he said. And by the way, Bob, it's been that way for a long time. Longer than when I've been here. It's been that way under Obama, and it's been that way a long time. There was great division under Obama. It was a much more silent division, but there was tremendous hatred and tremendous division, more than there is now. You're convinced of that? Yeah, I am. In the 2016 election, Trump had clearly seen and used those divisions, the seething undertow of rage and resentment. Look, we talked about this, I said. We talked about history's clock, remember that? 6 months earlier in December, I had referenced Barbara Tuchman's famous 1962 book, The Guns of August, about how World War I had been an accidental war. I had described the beginning of Tuchman's book to Trump, a scene about the old order not realizing it was dying on history's clock. And I said my analysis was that you came and seized history's clock when you were elected, and that the Democrats and your party, the Republicans, did not know what was going on in America. Remember that? Agree with that? Sure, Trump said. I do. It's still true. It's still true about, the Democrats and many people in the Republican Party. But I know what's going on. There's been a shift, I said, and it's substantial. And it's, I think, incumbent on white privileged people like myself, like you, to say, and I don't think this is Kool-Aid, I think it is understanding points of view that may not come to us naturally. But I don't have to be there to understand a point of view, he said. I don't have to be black to understand the black point of view. I don't have to have gone through personal slavery in order to understand the horrible atrocity that people have suffered. I don't have to. I don't have to put myself in that position. I can fully understand it without being in that position. Do you consider it an atrocity? Oh, absolutely, he said. Slavery? Absolutely. And what's happened after, up to this day, that we do not have a system of equality and equal opportunity? You can hear him exhale on the tape. Well, I'm pushing, I said. It's gone on for 100 years, Bob. Sure, but it's been going on for 100 years plus, he said. You see what I'm asking? I fully do. No, it's very fair. It's been going on for 100 years plus. It's been going on for a long time, and we've made a lot of progress in a lot of different ways. And a lot of progress is being made as we speak. Right now. More than you would even think. But this has been going on for many, many years. Many, many years. We've talked about this, I said. Your job is to bring people together? I agree, he said. But before I can bring them together, sometimes you have to bring them to a point. We've made a lot of progress in the last short period of time. Don't forget, until the Chinese plague came in, we had the lowest unemployment in the history of this country for African Americans. We had the lowest unemployment numbers by far, African American. We had the lowest for Asian, Hispanic too. But we had the best employment numbers in the history of our country, and then we got hit with the plague. Now here's what's happening. I'm building up the economy. He said the recovery would not just be a V shape, but almost an I, apparently meaning straight back up. Look at the job numbers. Look at the retail sales numbers. Look at these numbers that are coming in. Wait till you see the third quarter, how good it's going to be when your book comes out. I wanted to move beyond the economic numbers. He did not. Look at the numbers, he said, and repeated. We had the highest employment numbers in history 2 weeks ago. We had the best retail sales numbers increase in history 2 days ago. In history, Bob. But this, wait till you see the numbers come in, he said. For people out there struggling. For people, yeah, but they won't be struggling for long, Bob. They're struggling because we had to turn it off. Because if I didn't turn it off, we would have lost 3 million lives instead of 150,000 or whatever the final number will be. But it will be in that vicinity. We would have lost 3 million lives, and you know what? That's not acceptable. 3 million lives. I didn't know what projections he based that figure on. Okay, I said. Let me ask this question, please. Bear with me on this because I think it's one of the pillars of trying to understand. And if I'm a black man out there, how am I going to say to myself, President Trump understands my plight, my pain. And he is, the numbers, yes, I understand the work on the economy. Wait till you see, by the third quarter, he said. By the time your book, well, I don't know when your book is coming out, but by the election, we will have some of the greatest numbers released by any country. And it's already happening, Bob, unless some crazy thing happens. But do you think that the person out there wants the president to understand how they feel? I do. Let me just tell you, I passed criminal justice reform. Obama couldn't get it done. I passed opportunity zones. Obama and all these people that came before me, not only Obama, couldn't get it done. Nobody could get done what I got done. I got prison reform done. I got criminal justice reform done. Forget all about the good economic numbers, which will be just as good in a very short, because I turned it off, and then I turned it back on. Have you won the hearts of minorities and black people in this country who feel pain and anguish and are angry? Have you won their hearts? That's my question. Okay, you ready? He asked. Yes, I did, prior to the plague coming in. But now a lot of those jobs that were won, the black people had the lowest unemployment numbers in history. Okay, but they had the best jobs. They were making more money than they ever made. You look at the polls, you look at the protests, and you talk to people, I said. They'll be employed very soon, Bob. It's all coming back. They're going to be employed. Okay, before the plague, they had the best numbers ever. Everybody was doing great. They were getting tremendous increases. They were making more money, and people were happy. When the plague came in from China, then a lot of people lost jobs. Those jobs are all coming back. Black people will all be employed very soon, just like they were before, and the numbers will even be better. But as you know, and as you've said, the murder of George Floyd triggered something in people, I said. Not just black people, minorities, but in white people who are saying, like I'm trying to say, I think I've been a privileged white person. I know you have been, right? There was a 3-second pause in the conversation. No, I prompted. I don't get into that argument, he said. I've done a good job for black people. I've done the best job of any president since Lincoln. Now here's the other question, I said. I don't get into that, he said. There's no point to getting into it. All I can do is what I'm doing. I have done the best job of any president of the United States history other than Abraham Lincoln for black people. I got criminal justice reform. I got black colleges and universities. Have you won their hearts, I asked, because this is a business of the heart. I wondered, did he not understand? I'll let you know that at the end of my term when they get their jobs back, the president said. By the end of the year, you're going to see numbers like nobody's ever seen before. And it's already happened, Bob. 2 days ago, you had the greatest retail sales numbers in history, Bob. The percentage increase between April and May was indeed the largest since the Commerce Department began tracking retail sales, although it was not the highest amount. Trump went on. Now they're all saying Trump was right. It's beyond a V. In fact, the market's up today almost 200 points. We're ready to set a record on the stock market, and the pandemic is ending. It's weaving its way out. And by the way, we're going to have a vaccine soon, and we're going to have therapeutics soon. Hey, Bob, could I call you later so I can get to these generals to make sure everything's good? I said I still wanted to push on some of these questions. I don't mind, he said. I hope you're truthful. If you're truthful, you're going to write a great book. And if you're not truthful, you're going to hit me. I called him again that night. He did not call back. I wondered if that might be the last conversation we'd have. 45. Trump returned my call 3 days later, June 22nd at 8:15 p.m. I just got to the White House, and I'm watching an event go down where they're trying to rip down a statue in Washington, D.C., and we're stopping them with great force, I think. Protesters were trying to tear down the Andrew Jackson statue in Lafayette Square. As we spoke, police began to push protesters away from the still-standing statue with tear gas and batons. I'll let you know, Trump said, but it's terrible what's going on. Terrible. What do you think of all that? I asked. I think it's a disgrace. I think it's disgraceful. And it's been going on for a long time, indirectly. But it's gotten more direct, and I've stopped them. On the federal basis, I've stopped them strongly. But some of these states are, in some cases, foolish, in some cases, weak. He wanted to talk about his rally in Tulsa, his first in 60 days, which had been held over the weekend. Less than half of the arena was filled, and Trump had to stare into rows of empty blue seats, the focus of most media coverage. It just came out that the headline, quote, Trump rally gives Fox News the largest Saturday night audience in its history, he read to me. I'd say that's not bad, even by your standard, right? For 2 weeks, he said, these people did nothing but talk about, if you go there, it's going to be a death chamber. You'll die, essentially. They basically said horrible, horrible things about, don't go there, don't go, don't go. The networks, the fake news. Then we had protesters there who were quite violent. Tulsa's top public health official had said he wished the event could be postponed, calling it a huge risk factor. All the accounts I found said there was very little violence. The first empty seats I've ever had, he said. How long did you work on your speech? I asked. You're using the teleprompter on that. You have to? Maybe 25 or 30% teleprompter, he said. The rest was ad-lib. How long have I worked on it? It's a very interesting question. I guess my whole life I've worked on it, right? No, when you think of it, no, I didn't work on it. I tend to be able to tell stories when I get up to a microphone. Turning to the virus, he said China could have stopped it. I believe they could have stopped it. First Lady Melania Trump came in and briefly joined the call. Honey, I'm talking to Bob Woodward, Trump said. I mentioned the new book, The Art of Her Deal by Mary Jordan, a colleague of mine at the Washington Post. So they did that book on you, I said, and they're giving all kinds of credit to you for knowing how to live with this man. Melania laughed. I didn't know this, Trump said. What book is this? I want to read this one. He told her that I was doing a book on him. It'll probably be atrocious, but that's okay. I wanted to ask more about the protesters. I think you probably think they're wonderful people, Trump said. I made an argument for listening. I, as a reporter, have to understand how people reach conclusions, what their emotions are. Okay, I'm okay with that. You have to step out of your own shoes, I said. Yeah. Don't you? Yeah, you do, Trump said. But you can see things even from your shoes. I laughed. Okay. I don't think you necessarily have to be there. You can see it from both ways, he said. In our previous conversation, the president had accused me of drinking the Kool-Aid when I asked him about the idea of white privilege and the anger and pain of black people. My question to you, I said, and this is the Kool-Aid question, do you understand people who feel passionately? I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is real. There are a lot of people who are angry and feel pain. You were saying, hey, look, I can't be those people. That's quite true. But I think it's really important to step out of your shoes. That's okay, he said. I get it. I'm okay with that. I reminded him I had my tape recorder on. That's okay, I don't mind. You can have it on. I'm a straight shooter. I said, I thought people wanted to hear the president talking to black people in this country about what you understand they've gone through. And we can get to what your remedy is and what you're going to fix. But do you understand you're a person of white privilege just like I am? And the question is, can somebody like you, because of your position, step out and say, I've got some breaks, I've had advantages. There are people out there who have not, and I understand their anger and their fierce resentment of people like you and people like me. I feel I do understand it, Trump said. But if I didn't understand it, I would not have done criminal justice reform that nobody was able to do but me. I would not have done opportunity zones, which have had a tremendously positive impact on areas that were absolutely dying. I would not have funded long-term historically black colleges and universities, known as HBCUs. But I wouldn't have done it if I didn't understand it. In other words, if I was not extremely sympathetic to the cause and the plight of what they've gone through, of what, African Americans and the black community has gone through, I would not have done, a vast amount of money for historically black colleges and universities. In December 2019, Trump had signed a bill continuing $255 million in annual funding to HBCUs and other schools serving primarily minority students. The question is, I asked, what's in your heart? I think people want to understand that you understand. What's the essence of your responsibility as president? I think the essence of my responsibility is to do a good job for all communities. Suppose I had 10 Black Lives Matter people here as a focus group, and I said, here's President Trump, and this is what President Trump wants to say to you about how he can step out of his shoes to understand what life is like in your shoes. And what are you going to say? I'm somebody that likes to get things done rather than talk. Sometimes when you get in these things, I said, you have to lay it on yourself. And there's no bigger yourself in this country than you as president. And I'm not trying to get you to say something you don't feel. I'm asking whether you can understand the plight, struggle, pain of people. I mean, it's real. It's been an awakening for me, if I may say that at my age. I'm older than you, 77. To see that they're saying it's been a raw deal and I've not liked it and it's a form of oppression. It's a new form of slavery that has occurred in this country that you're president of. And I want to make sure I understand what you want to say to them. You understand that? Yeah, I do, Bob. I think this. I think that I have some wonderful, what I can do best is get things done. And I have some wonderful things that I'm going to be doing for the black community in the United States. And I did a lot of it until the Chinese virus hit us so hard. If a member of my focus group said to you, President Trump, do you understand me? What would you say? I asked. I would say that I really believe I do. And that's why I've done so much for the black community. He gave his list again. Do you think there is systematic or institutional racism in this country? I asked. Well, I think there is everywhere, Trump said. I think probably less here than most places, or less here than many places. But, I asked, is it here in a way that it has an impact on people's lives? I think it is, and it's unfortunate, but I think it is. He had at least said it. But there's a spiritual dimension to this, I said, where I think people want somebody to get up and say, hey, I get it. I really am moving toward getting my feet in your shoes. I know you wouldn't like this, but remember Hillary Clinton went on a listening tour? Do you need to go on a listening tour and listen to people? I think I listen to people. I think I listen to people all the time. I like to listen to people. I hear what people are saying. I'm able to get things done economically, and that's a very big part of the problem. I'll tell you what, had we been allowed to carry on that great economy, had we not gotten hit by this artificial situation, it was an operation like a patient gets operated on. And now we're starting all over again. Well, yeah, pretty much. Had I not built a strong foundation for the country, you wouldn't be able to have the kind of numbers that were announced last week on jobs, etc., etc. Trump seems to be referring to the June 5th jobs numbers, which was the most recent information released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. While tens of millions were still out of work, 2.5 million jobs had been added in May. I do hear what people are saying. I do understand what they're saying. And I'm doing things about it, including economic things. It could heal a lot of hearts. A good economy can take care of a lot of problems. Nothing gets rid of all of them, Bob. Nothing. Problems can disappear. And that's what I'd like to do. You remember when Bob Costa and I came and talked to you before you got the nomination in 2016, I asked? They were doing renovation on your hotel. And this is when you said to us, I bring out rage in people. I bring rage out. I always have. I don't know if it's an asset or a liability, but whatever it is, I do. Is that true? Yes, Trump said. Sometimes. I do more things than other people are able to get done. And that, sometimes, can make my opponents unhappy. They view me differently than they view other presidents. A lot of other presidents that you've covered didn't get a lot done, Bob. What do you think of your Justice Gorsuch, who kind of led the charge against you on LGBTQ issues? Neil Gorsuch had just authored a 6-3 opinion ruling that the Civil Rights Act protects gay and transgender people from workplace discrimination. Well, it's the way he felt. It's the way he felt, Trump said. It was against your administration's position, I said. Yeah, Trump said, but this is the way he felt. And I want people to go the way they feel. I mean, he felt he was doing the right thing. I do think it opens the spigots for a lot of litigation. Suppose, I asked, Donald Trump was on the Supreme Court. How would he vote on this? I don't see you voting against freedom for more people. I don't want to comment, he said. I asked about his poll numbers that showed he was in trouble against Biden. You see different polls than I do, he said. I think we're doing fine. The campaign hasn't really started. It's starting, over the next few weeks. He returned to the Tulsa rally with the Chinese virus in the room, as he put it. There were empty seats, he said, because people said, hey, I'll watch it on television. And they did, because it was a very big night, and a tremendous night, even bigger online. He shifted to his recent graduation speech at West Point. I made a very good speech, and they refused to cover it. They covered that, and they were saying, maybe he has Parkinson's, because of the way he shuffled slowly down a steep ramp, inch by inch, and literally, you've done that, where you have a steep surface, and I had very slippery shoes. Believe it or not, if you have leather shoes, they're very slippery on the bottom. I'm covered very, very unfairly, including polls. In 2016, he said, I had a poll, the Washington Post ABC poll, 2.5 weeks out. I was 14 points behind, and I knew it wasn't true. We complained about it. And I think that, but it was the Washington Post, your favorite newspaper, and ABC. And you remember, they came out with a poll 2 weeks, and I said, there's no way. This was basically correct. An ABC poll had Clinton ahead by 12 points. Trump was traveling far down memory lane. How do you rate that election, Bob? 2016. Was that one of the great of all time, or was it? It's hard to, people consider that to be a moment in history like no other. What's your feeling on that, even though you don't call yourself a historian? In 2016, I had said Trump could win. I think I'm in a much better position than I was then, Trump said, because I've done a lot. I also think I have a much weaker opponent. He turns to Hillary Clinton. Whether you like her or not, she's a horrible human being, but whether you like her or not, she was smart, and very devious, very tricky, very smart. And you said you're 77, 78? That means you're the same age as Joe. But it hasn't hit you. It may someday, but it has hit Joe. And you know that. I mean, look, you see what's going on. It's a weird deal. He couldn't do it in prime time. I used to call him 1% Joe. Hold on, let me see something. He was watching television or getting some news. I'm just seeing something coming across the, oh, that's funny. I didn't know what it was, and he didn't say. What's debating Biden going to be like, I asked. I think he did at least even against Bernie, Trump said. I was surprised that he was able to get through that debate. And he didn't win it, but he didn't lose it. It was a pretty even debate. And I was surprised. So you never know what happens. Yeah, I agreed. You never know what happens, he said again, returning to memory lane. But let's see what happens. I've had some very good debates. I wouldn't be talking to you if I didn't have good debates. You know that. My best debate was probably the second debate with Crooked Hillary. I mean, that was a great debate. The second debate, held on October 9th, 2016, had been somewhat overshadowed by the release of the Access Hollywood tape 2 days before. I reminded Trump that on our last call we had talked about historian Barbara Tuchman's book about World War I and history's clock, and the whole business of what happened in 2016, I said. And you came along, and the Democrats and your own party had no idea what was going on in America. Yep, he said. Got them by surprise, Bob. Caught them by surprise. I'll get them by surprise again, Bob. You watch. Where's history's clock? I asked. Well, we're going to find out. I've done a lot. China set me back. I was sailing. I told you, I feel so differently toward the whole thing with China. This is such a terrible ordeal for the world. Not only just us, for the whole world. I said that some experts said, if you were going to imagine a virus that would attack with such efficiency and be so lethal on somebody's lungs, you could not have designed a better one. And there's some people who think that they manipulated this, as you know. Oh, sure, I've heard that, Trump said. I've heard many theories. I've also heard that it was incompetence. I've heard that it was a mistake. I've heard mistake, I've heard incompetence, and I've heard, manipulation, I asked. And what's the reality? Because that's important. Well, he said, I think we may find the reality at some point, but right now, nobody knows for sure. If they engineered this and intentionally let it out into the world, I said. Well, how come they got hit so hard? Trump asked. They couldn't control it. I think they didn't realize what it was, and your experts can't get the real numbers from them. That's right, he said, but the numbers are substantial, very, very substantial. We are at one of those pivot points in history, I said, and you are in charge. I had the greatest economy that we've ever had, Trump said mournfully. Stock market hit all-time highs in history. I was riding so high, the market was riding so high. The stock market had been climbing steadily since 2009, regularly hitting new highs, until the coronavirus-related shutdowns resulted in a historic crash in February 2020. At the time of our interview, the markets were showing signs of recovery. The question, he said, was, can we take this all the way to that very special date of November 3rd? 46. Trump called me unexpectedly on Wednesday, July 8th, before his day of meetings with Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. I'm so busy, Trump said, I don't have time to breathe. I don't think he intended any reference to George Floyd. This will be our 17th conversation for this book, I said. All I ask for is fairness, Trump said. And I'm sure I won't get it, but that's okay. I'm used to that. But I do ask for fairness because nobody's done what I've done. Nobody. Did you get the new list of new things that were added on? It was a long boilerplate list of dozens of large and small matters, and I said I did receive it. What, I asked, was he trying to accomplish in the two speeches he had just given over the 4th of July weekend, one at Mount Rushmore and the other at the White House? Both painted divisive portraits of some citizens threatening the country, a kind of reemergence in tone of American carnage from his inaugural address. As best I could tell, presidents of both parties universally gave unifying and inspiring speeches on July 4th, a freebie of goodwill. In the Mount Rushmore speech, you talk about a new far-left fascism, I said. He had said there was a merciless campaign to wipe out our history. Angry mobs are trying to tear down statues of our founders, and this left-wing cultural revolution is designed to overthrow the American Revolution. I said, there's some people who represent that kind of anger, the radical left, but it's not much. The next day in the White House speech, Trump had said that, like the American heroes who defeated the Nazis, we are now in the process of defeating the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the looters. I said there were no Marxists left. No, Trump said, that's wrong, Bob. Black Lives Matter, what they do is they literally have it in their website that they're Marxists. One of the co-founders claimed in 2015 that she and other organizers of Black Lives Matter were trained Marxists. It was not, however, on their website. The Black Lives Matter phrase has been adopted as a reformist slogan by the broader social movement for racial justice. What are you saying to people? I asked the president. In the second speech, you said, our movement, referring to your movement and your base. Never forget, we are one family and one nation. Right, Trump said. Black Lives Matter people look at all of this and they say they're not being invited in, that you've put up a wall around your base. And the question is, what's your intent? He didn't answer, but said, I have done more for the black community than any other president other than Abraham Lincoln. I said that Lyndon Johnson certainly had done more. The passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a monumental achievement. It outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, or sex, further mandated the desegregation of schools, the prohibition of racial discrimination in employment, and protections against the unequal application of requirements for voter registration. But it's about the heart, I said. I have done a tremendous amount for the black community, Trump said, and honestly, I'm not feeling any love. As soon as the China virus came in, as soon as the plague, China virus came in, as soon as it came in, those poll numbers all of a sudden started inching back down, 8 or 9 or 10%, and I don't understand that. I don't, because nobody blames me for the virus. Of course, many people, and perhaps history, might blame him for mishandling the crisis. It's a matter of the heart and the spirit, I said. Are you saying to people who are Black Lives Matter, who are minorities in this country, you are welcome here? The door is very wide open, he said. I want to include all people. I want to include all Americans. The door is absolutely open. And he went back to his talking points about all he had done for black Americans. So what's your goal here? My goal is to do a great job as president, he said. He talked about numbers, jobs growth. He seemed not to understand that I was trying to ask about outreach and healing. You'll do a third book in the next year, he said. Next year's going to be a fantastic year. Watch. As you know, I said, the virus is on fire. Absolutely on fire. It's only on fire because of our testing, because we're testing 40 million people, he said. But the percentage of positive tests was also going up, a key indicator of trouble. Trump also said that the death rate was down. I reminded Trump that Fauci had said publicly earlier in the week that it's a false narrative to take comfort in a lower rate of death because with the huge growth in cases, the death rate would go up in a matter of weeks. He didn't answer, but recycled his arguments with Fauci. The question is, where are we now? I asked. We're in great shape, Trump said. Most of the country is headed absolutely away from the virus. We're totally set with our hospitals. We're totally set. Okay, but it's on fire, sir, I said. Because we did 40 million people. Anybody that has the sniffles, any kid that has a little bit of a cold, they test positive. And it's going to go away in 2 days. It's ridiculous. I was surprised that Trump was trivializing a positive test in a child as he continued to criticize his public health officials. Have you called Tony Fauci in and sat him down in the Oval Office? I asked. He couldn't win that argument with me, Trump said. He cannot win that argument. If he hadn't acted, he said, we would have had 3 million dead instead of 130,000 as of today. Trump was correct. The travel restrictions on China and Europe and the initial shutdowns did save lives. As a citizen, somebody who lives here, I said, I'm worried as I can be about this whole thing. Don't worry about it, Bob, okay? Trump said. Don't worry about it. We'll get to do another book. You'll find I was right. What I've learned in the world of Trump is news cycles don't last very long, Kushner said on Monday, July 13th, as he reviewed the overall Trump strategic picture with a top staffer. He's had a string of bad luck, Kushner said, especially with the virus. He'll get a couple of breaks along the way, and when he does, hopefully we'll take advantage of them. So he's getting ready for the fight, and his head's getting in the game. It's also about just getting his head out of D.C., right? D.C. is filled with a lot of traps. Meanwhile, the public polling across the board showed Biden beating Trump by double digits and winning the battleground states. Kushner's 3 separate private polls, however, painted a much more favorable picture. He did his own data with big samples. Our polls basically show that he's either ahead or in the margin of error in all the states he won last time. Kushner continued, the whole thing with polling is, it's about getting likely voters, number one, as opposed to registered voters. Public polling is using registered voters, not likely, and they're definitely skewing the turnout model. And so we believe it is a different race than other people believe. So it was similar to 2016. Trump voters simply were more enthusiastic and highly motivated. Kushner's turnout model reflected a much higher percentage of Trump voters going to the polls. Biden's had about as good a couple months as he could get, being hidden, Kushner said. And so at some point there's going to be a real discussion of him. Biden's reliance on Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's liberal ideas amounted to a long political suicide note, Kushner said. The goal with Trump, Kushner said, is to get his head from governing to campaigning. When I learned about this, I was incredulous. In the midst of the largest public health crisis in a century, Kushner thought it was time to turn to campaigning. But the virus was all about governing. It could not be campaigned away. I think, Kushner continued, that for 5 years, since Trump started to run, he basically was on offense. And then for 4.5 months, since the virus exploded, he was on defense. And the goal is to get him back to offense. The offense soon appeared. First, the White House released a document listing the number of times Fauci had been wrong in his predictions about COVID-19, a highly unusual and, from a health point of view, irresponsible effort to undermine the chief of infectious diseases. Fauci had privately acknowledged he was not by any means always correct, but polling showed that he was trusted by at least twice as many people as Trump. Second, on Tuesday, July 14th, Trump took an early opportunity to attack Biden in what was billed as a press conference in the Rose Garden on China. Instead, he spoke for 57 minutes and mentioned Biden 30 times before taking questions for 6 minutes. Because Trump was reading from some text or notes, he looked down many times, and the speech had none of the fire and passion of his rally performances. New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker wrote in an article that appeared on page 17, even for a president who rarely sticks to the script and wanders from thought to thought, it was one of the most rambling performances of his presidency. Third, on Wednesday night, July 15th, Trump replaced Brad Parscale as his campaign manager, demoting him to a senior advisor. Trump was still angry about the low attendance, empty seat rally in Tulsa and the poor public poll numbers. This effectively ended Parscale's hope for a movie, a new cash haul from Republicans who might want his expertise in a 2024 presidential race and a place in the Campaign Manager Hall of Fame. Trump named Bill Stepien, a longtime political aide, his new campaign manager. Kushner considered Stepien one of the most talented political operatives around. They were close, and Kushner's control of the campaign would continue. Trump called me unexpectedly on the morning of Tuesday, July 21st. The reason, he said, was to say hello. How are you doing? I turned on my recorder and we held our 18th interview for about half an hour. The manuscript for this book was due to my publisher this day. Things are getting bad, I said, aren't they? Bad in what way? He asked, as if he was surprised. The virus, I said. New daily cases were at about 60,000, with deaths near 1,000 each day. Well, it's flaring up. It's flaring up all over the world, Bob. By the way, all over the world. That was one thing I noticed last week. You know, they talk about this country. All over the world it's flaring up, but we have it under control. What? I said. He noticed last week? The virus had been out of control for months. Texas and Florida were being hit, he said. But his ambivalence was on full display in the next sentence. But we have it under control. We have it absolutely. I believe but it's a tough. There's no question. What grade would you give yourself on the handling of the coronavirus, I asked. Well, I think I'd give myself a very good grade because what we've done, we were totally. When I took over, there was nothing. There were no provisions. No one was prepared for this. What have you learned about yourself? I asked. Once again, he returned to Mueller's investigation. I was fighting the fake Russia thing. I asked again about the virus. When we started talking in December, if I said to you, we're going to have a virus that comes and kills 140,000 people in this country, you would think I was smoking something, I said. Well, all my life I've heard the word pandemic, he said. But somehow you never think of that as a modern-day thing that could happen. But it's happened, I said. Biden is not really your opponent. The virus is your opponent. Do you agree? Well, I think that's largely true, he said. It's the virus, and it's a radical left group of people, and it's the media. The media is my opponent regardless of anything. No matter how well we do, they will say we didn't do well. But 140,000 people have died, I said. But we have a much bigger country, the president said. If you look at China, they have many more people that died. They just don't report it. If you look at Russia, if you look at India. The U.S. at this time had the 8th highest per capita death rate. Jared said you are getting back on offense, I said. Is this the strategy? Back on offense? I listed the examples of the previous week, attacking Biden in the Rose Garden, the White House attack on Fauci, and the removal of his campaign manager. I have a very flexible strategy, Bob. I've had it for a long time. My whole life has been flexible strategy, and I've done very well. And I had it in the last campaign, too. I was very flexible. I changed campaign managers 3 times. Is it offense now, or is it governing? I asked. You understand what I'm asking. I won the last campaign in the last 4 weeks, but I would really say I won it in the last week. I did rallies. I did many, many things in the last week. Okay, but is it offense, or is it governing? I think it's really both. It's a combination of governing and a political campaign. We have 105 days. Now to me, 105 days is a very long time. It's an eternity. In July, it's not clear what the plan is, I said. He mentioned immigration, healthcare, and DACA. I returned to the virus and recalled for him a discussion we had in April about a strategy and a matrix and a roadmap for him to lead. Well, I am leading. But we have a lot of great leaders around the world and their countries are stymied. We are not stymied. But you have a lot of great leaders around the world and this has affected them very, very powerfully. What about the plan? I asked. I've got 106 days, he said. That's a long time. You know, if I put out a plan now, people won't even remember it in 100. I won the last election in the final week. No, I said, but it's not just put out the plan, it's execute it, isn't it? No, I am executing. You'll see it starting. I've already started. But you will see things being signed, documents being signed. This isn't just a plan, this is getting it done. I will have immigration done. I will have healthcare done. I think we're going to have vaccines soon, he said. I think we already have them, but they're in tests, and you'll see them being announced over the next month. Now, would you view that as a game changer? I again asked for the grade he would give himself. I give ourselves an A, but the grade is incomplete, and I'll tell you why. If we come up with the vaccines and therapeutics, then I give myself an A+. I've talked to lots of your predecessors, I said. I never talked to Nixon, but I talked to many of them. They get philosophical when I ask the question, what have you learned about yourself? And that's the question on you. What have you learned about yourself? Trump sighed audibly. I can handle more than other people can handle. Because, and I'll tell you what, whether I learned it about myself, more people come up to me and say, and I mean very strong people that are successful even, a lot of people, they say, I swear to you, I don't know how it's possible for you to handle what you handle. How you've done this, with the kind of opposition, the kind of shenanigans, the kind of illegal witch hunts. It's a tough job, I acknowledged. Tougher for me than probably just about anybody, he said. I would think. People are worried about the virus, I said. I know that, Bob, but the virus has nothing to do with me. It's not my fault. It's China let the damn virus out. But you have the problem, I said. And the question is, what's the plan? How are you going to lead? In November, I continued, the question is, we're going to look back and we're going to say, end of July, August, September, October, what happened with the virus? I have opposition like nobody has. And that's okay. I've had that all my life. I've always had it. And this has been, my whole life has been like this. In the meantime, right now, I'm looking at the White House, okay? I'm staring right at the walls of the White House. It seemed to be his way of reminding me that he was the president. He continued, we've got 105 days. Let's see how it turns out. I was unlucky with the virus. But you got it, I said. The country's got it, and the world's got it. But you're in charge of the country. You're in charge of the national interest. Will I get credit for it? He asked. Probably not, but I'll take credit. Presidents have power, I said. Extraordinary power, and people are leaning on you. They do have extraordinary power, Trump said, but in my case, they never accepted it. And they never accepted this president because they're a bunch of dishonest people. And they spied on my campaign, and we caught them. They spied before and after I won, and we caught them. And we caught them cold. Let's see what happens. I talked about how in my business, we try to understand people. You don't understand me, he said. You don't understand me, but that's okay. You'll understand me after the election, but you don't understand me now. I don't think you get it, and that's okay. He wanted to make sure I had the list of his accomplishments. But on the issues before you, I said, you know what number 1 is? The virus. Number 2's the virus. Number 3 is the virus. Then he displayed his ambivalence about his role again. No, he said first, and then added, I agree with that. Then he added, but that was thrown upon me when we were riding high. The election was over. I was going to win easily, and all of a sudden we got hit with the China virus, and now I'm working my ass off. And he abruptly said, so long, Bob. Good luck. 7 hours later, Trump gave a long statement at his first coronavirus task force press conference in 3 months. He spoke alone at the White House. No Pence, Fauci, or Birx. He also shifted tone. Everything was not rosy with the outlook for the virus. It will probably, unfortunately, get worse before it gets better, Trump said, injecting an unusual dose of realism. Something I don't like saying about things, but that's the way it is. Previously, Trump had been reluctant to wear a mask. Get a mask, he said. Whether you like the mask or not, they have an impact. They'll have an effect, and we need everything we can get. His comments were a tacit acknowledgement that his previous approach had not worked, and that, in fact, the virus was much worse. The day was a microcosm of Trump's presidency, veering from we have it under control to worse before it gets better, all in the span of a few hours. It was just the most recent example, and the last before this book went to press, that Trump's presidency was riddled with ambivalence, set on an uncertain course, swinging from combativeness to conciliation, and whipsawing from one statement or action to the opposite. Epilogue. After I finished reporting for this book on President Trump, I felt weariness. The country was in real turmoil. The virus was out of control. The economy was in crisis with more than 40 million out of work. A powerful reckoning on racism and inequality was upon us. There seems to be no end in sight, and certainly no clear path to get there. I thought back to the conversation with Trump on February 7th when he mentioned the dynamite behind every door, the unexpected explosion that could change everything. He was apparently thinking about some external event that would affect the Trump presidency. But now, I've come to the conclusion that the dynamite behind the door was in plain sight. It was Trump himself. The oversized personality, the failure to organize, the lack of discipline, the lack of trust in others he had picked, in experts, the undermining or the attempted undermining of so many American institutions, the failure to be a calming, healing voice, the unwillingness to acknowledge error, the failure to do his homework, to extend the olive branch, to listen carefully to others, to craft a plan. Mattis, Tillerson, and Coates are all conservatives or apolitical people who wanted to help him and the country. Imperfect men who answered the call to public service. They were not the deep state. Yet each departed with cruel words from their leader. They concluded that Trump was an unstable threat to their country. Think about that for a moment. The top national security leaders thought the President of the United States was a danger to the country. Trump said the intelligence people needed to go back to school. The generals were stupid. The media was fake news. Trump had spent so many years undermining people who challenged him. Not only his opponents, but those who worked for him and for the American public. And here was the problem. By undermining so many others, not only had he shaken confidence in them, but he had shaken confidence in himself. This was particularly apparent when the country most needed to feel the government knew what it was doing in an unprecedented health crisis. Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, maybe had it more right than he knew when he said understanding Trump meant understanding Alice in Wonderland. Trump talked a lot, almost incessantly, so much that he weakened the microphone of the presidency and the bully pulpit, and too many people no longer trusted what he said. Half or more of the country seems to be in a perpetual rage about him, and he seems to enjoy it. I think of Robert Redfield knowing that the virus fight would not be merely 6 months or a year, it would be 2 to 3 years. Of Trump repeatedly saying the virus would disappear or blow away, and of the enormous wearing down of public health officials to not stray too far from the president's message. I close out this book with a belief that almost anything can happen in the Trump presidency. Anything. Lots could get better, or worse, or much worse. It is unlikely lots could get much better. For the moment, in the middle of the summer, the virus, the economy, and the internal political divisions define Trump. The intensity of those divisions is at its height. The concentration of power in the presidency has been growing for decades, and the power of the president might be at an all-time high under Trump. Trump uses it especially in dominating the media. Trump has talked very tough, often in a way that unsettles even his supporters. But he has not imposed martial law or suspended the Constitution, despite predictions of his opponents. He and his Attorney General William Barr have several times challenged the traditional rule of law. Unnecessarily, in my view. Using the justice system to reward friends and pay back enemies is petty and Nixonian. Constitutional government might seem wobbly at times, and that could change overnight. Still, democracy has held. But leadership has failed. What did Trump want to accomplish? What were his goals? Too often, he seemed not to know himself. Decision by tweet, often without warning to those charged with executing his policies, was one of the biggest sticks of dynamite behind the door. His relationship and letters with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, outlined in detail here, were not by the foreign policy establishment playbook. But as Trump says repeatedly, we had no war. That was an achievement. Diplomacy should always be worth a try. It may have been worth it. Where it goes next is one of the imponderables of the Trump era. Is Trump's and Kim's mutual pledge of fealty, the fantasy film, sustainable as Kim is more threatening? We'll see, as Trump says all the time. The shadowy presence of Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner is another imponderable. Highly competent, but often shockingly misguided in his assessments, Kushner's role is jarring. Was there no one else to act as chief of staff? Trump's friends are mostly others with money or social standing, or those who liked to talk on the phone at night. Was there no real friend who shared Trump's interest in governing who could help and be called to service? Senator Lindsey Graham, Trump's first friend in the Senate, has often been portrayed as embarrassingly and shamelessly subservient to the president, but actually at times provided wise counsel, urging Trump to take a strategic view. On January 28, 2020, when Trump's national security advisor and his deputy warned Trump that the virus would be, not might be, but would be, the biggest national security threat to his presidency, the leadership clock had to be reset. It was a detailed forecast, supported by evidence and experience that unfortunately turned out to be correct. Presidents are the executive branch. There was a duty to warn, to listen, to plan, and to take care. For a long time, Trump hedged, as did others, and said the virus is worrisome, but not yet, not now. There were good reasons to ride both horses, but there should have been more consistent and courageous outspokenness. Leading is almost always risky. The virus, the plague, as Trump calls it, put the United States and the world in economic turmoil that may not be just a recession, but a depression. It is a genuine financial crisis, putting tens of millions out of work. Trump's solution is to try to recreate what he believes is the economic miracle he created in the pre-virus time. Democrats, Republicans, and Trump did agree to spending at least $2.2 trillion on recovery, which will create its own future problems with growing deficits. The human cost has been almost unimaginable, with more than 130,000 Americans killed by the virus by July, and no real end in sight. The deep-seated hatreds of American politics flourished in the Trump years. He stoked them, and did not make concerted efforts to bring the country together. Nor did the Democrats. Trump felt deeply wronged by the Democrats, who felt deeply wronged by Trump. The walls between them only grew higher and thicker. My 17 interviews with Trump presented a challenge. He denounced Fear, my first book on him, as untrue, a scam, and a joke, calling me a Dem operative. Several of those closest to him told him that the book was true, and Lindsey Graham told him that I would not put words in his mouth and would report as accurately as possible. Trump decided, for reasons that are not clear to me, that he would cooperate. To his mind, he would become a reliable source. He is reliable at times, completely unreliable at others, and often mixed. I have tried to guide the listener as best I can. But the interviews show he vacillated, prevaricated, and at times dodged his role as leader of the country despite his I alone can fix it rhetoric. As America and the world know, Trump is an overpowering presence. He loves spectacle. Trump is a living paradox, capable of being friendly and appealing. He can also be savage, and his treatment of people is often almost unbelievable. In a time of crisis, the operational is much more important than the political or the personal. For tens of millions, the optimistic American story has turned to a nightmare. My wife, Elsa Walsh, who had worked for years as a reporter for the Washington Post and then as a staff writer for the New Yorker, and I spent endless hours sifting through the story of the Trump presidency, talking intensely for the last year. What was the remedy? The course that could have been taken, we asked. Was there a way to do better? Elsa suggested looking at a previous president who wanted to speak directly to the American people, unfiltered through the media, not just during troubling times, but during a major crisis. The model was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Over his 12 years as president, FDR gave 30 fireside chats. His aides and the public often clamored for more. FDR said no. It was important to limit his talks to the major events and to make them exceptional. He also said they were hard work, often requiring him to prepare personally for days. The evening radio addresses concerned the toughest issues facing the country. In a calm and reassuring voice, he explained what the problem was, what the government was doing about it, and what was expected of the people. Often, the message was grim. 2 days after Japan's December 7, 1941 surprise bombing attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR spoke to the nation. We must share together the bad news and the good news, the defeats and the victories, the changing fortunes of war. So far, the news has been all bad. We have suffered a serious setback. He added, it will not only be a long war, it will be a hard war. It was a question of survival. We are now fighting to maintain our right to live among our world neighbors in freedom and common decency. FDR invited the American people in. We are all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history. Japan had inflicted serious damage, and the casualty lists would be long. 7-day weeks in every war industry would be required. On the road ahead, there lies hard work, grueling work, day and night, every hour and every minute. And sacrifice, which was a privilege. Japan was allied with the fascist powers of Germany and Italy. FDR called for a systematic, grand strategy. A few months later, in another fireside chat, he asked Americans to pull out a world map to follow along with him as he described why the country needed to fight beyond Americans' borders. Your government has unmistakable confidence in your ability to hear the worst without flinching or losing heart. For nearly 50 years, I have written about 9 presidents, from Nixon to Trump, 20% of the 45 U.S. presidents. A president must be willing to share the worst with the people, the bad news with the good. All presidents have a large obligation to inform, warn, protect, to define goals and the true national interest. It should be a truth-telling response to the world, especially in crisis. Trump has instead enshrined personal impulse as a governing principle of his presidency. When his performance as president is taken in its entirety, I can only reach one conclusion. Trump is the wrong man for the job. Note to listeners. Nearly all interviews for this book were conducted under the journalist ground rule of deep background. This means that all the information could be used, but I would not say who provided it. The book is drawn from hundreds of hours of interviews with first-hand participants and witnesses to these events. Nearly all allowed me to tape record our interviews. When I have attributed exact quotations, thoughts, or conclusions to the participants, that information comes from the person, a colleague with direct knowledge, or from government or personal documents, calendars, diaries, emails, meeting notes, and other records. I interviewed President Trump 17 times on the record for this book. In one case, I took handwritten notes, and the other 16 were recorded with his permission. This is Robert Petkoff. Rage was written by Bob Woodward. It was recorded by Catherine Cook and Kathleen Conti at CDM Studios in New York City. Editing by Christina Picciano and Travis Tom. Post-production by Hudson Sound. The associate producer was Tiffany Ferrari. Rage was produced and directed by Karen Perlman. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio. Rage is available in print from Simon & Schuster. Also available from Simon & Schuster Audio, Fear, Trump in the White House, written by Bob Woodward and read by Robert Petkoff.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.